Here, at the risk of parting company with Dean Inge and even with Plato, I come to a radical conclusion. Spiritual life is not a worship of values, whether found in things or hypostatized into supernatural powers. It is the exact opposite. It is disintoxication from their influence. Not that spiritual insight can ever remove values from nature or cease to feel them in their moral black and white and in all their aesthetic iridescence. Spirit knows these vital necessities. It has been quickened in their bosom. All animals have within them a principle by which to distinguish good from evil, since their existence and welfare are furthered by some circumstances and acts, and are hindered by others. Self-knowledge, with a little experience of the world, will then easily set up the Socratic standard of values, natural and inevitable to any man or to any society. These values each society will disentangle in proportion to its intelligence and will defend in proportion to its vitality. But who would dream that spiritual life was at all concerned in asserting these human and local values to be alone valid, or in supposing that they were especially divine or bound to dominate the universe forever? In fact, the great masters of the spiritual life are evidently not the Greeks, not even the Alexandrian Greeks, but the Indians, their disciples elsewhere in the East, and those Muslims, Christians, and Jews who have surrendered precisely that early, unregenerate claim to be enveloped in a protecting world designed for their benefit or vindication, a claim of which Platonism, after all, was but a refined version. To cling to familiar treasures and affections is human, but it is not particularly spiritual. To apostatize these home values into a cosmic system, especially planned to guarantee them, certainly expresses an intelligible, passionate need for comfort and coddling in the universe. But with spirituality, it has nothing to do. If such confidence may be called faith, it may also be called fatuity and insolence. And insolence innocent in a spirited child, but out of place in a philosopher. Spirituality comes precisely of surrendering this animal arrogance and this moral fanaticism, and substituting for them pure intelligence, not a discoursing cleverness or skepticism, but perfect candor and impartial vision. Spirit is merciful and tender because it has no private motive to make it spiteful, yet it is unflinchingly austere because it cannot make any private motive its own. It need have no scientific or artistic pretensions. It appears quite adequately in straight seeing of simple things. These, to pure spirit, are speculative enough and good to whet its edge upon. The proudest dreams of science or theology are no better for the purpose. The spirit is content with the widow's mite and a cup of cold water. It considers the lilies of the field. It can say with literal truth, inasmuch as ye did it unto the least of these, ye did it unto me. As the Spirit is no respecter of persons, so it is no respecter of worlds. It is willing to put up with any of them, to be feasted in one or to be martyred in another. And while it is allowed to live, a point that concerns the world it lives in rather than the spirit itself, it looks with a clear and untroubled sympathy on such manifestations of being as happen to be unrolled before it. As it loves the non-human parts of nature, so it loves the human parts, and is in no way hostile to the natural passions and to the political and religious institutions that happen to prevail. If spirit was to be incarnate and to appear in existence at all, it had to be born in one odd world or another. Why should it quarrel with its earthly cradle? This is not to say that all circumstances are equally favorable to the spiritual life. On the contrary, most circumstances exclude it altogether. The vast abysses of nature seem to be uninhabited, and even where spirit feebly appears, it is in order to be very often stifled at once, or long tormented. The spirit is so deeply engaged and distracted by current events that it cannot realize its proper function, which is to see such things as come in its way under the form of eternity, in their intrinsic character and relative value, in their transitiveness and necessity, in a word, in their truth. This contemplative habit evidently finds a freer course in solitude than in society, in art than in business, in prayer than in argument. It is stimulated by beautiful and constant things more than by things ugly, tedious, crowded, or uncertain. For this reason, it is more prevalent and freer in the East than in the West, among Catholics than among Protestants, among Muslims than among Jews. For the same reason, the Platonic system, up to a certain point, is sympathetic to the spirit. Its universe was compact and immortal. The oscillations of fortune on earth could not disturb its unchangeable order. If nature were conceived to be, as in fact she is, barbarous and in indefinite flux, given rein to anything and everything, there would seem hardly to be time to reach perfection on any level of being before the soil was undermined and the budding idea was lost and dissipated. The great merit of an unchanging world is that all its inhabitants can be adapted to it. If they ever fall out of tune, the cause will be but a passing disease and an accidental slackness in the strings. It will be easy to screw up the pegs, to renew a snapped cord, and to restore the harmony. Such a world offers an immovable basis and sanction for the good. It establishes an orthodox morality. Imperfection enters it only below the circle of the moon, like bad manners below stairs. And even here, on earth, evil is but an oscillation and dizziness in matter. which nature perpetually calls back to the norm, as the motion of a top writes in its gyrations. I'm not confident, however, that a pure spirit would feel safe in such a seven-walled celestial castle, would prize the sort of safety which, if it were real, it would afford. Existence is contingent, essentially, as things might just as well have been different, so they might just as well prove to be inconstant. And since they cannot manifest their groundlessness by now being other than they happen to be, they may manifest it by being other at other times and places. No existing being can have the means of knowing that it will always exist or prosper in the universe. The neatest cosmos and the most solitary God might collide with something unsuspected, or the unsuspected thing might exist in its own preserves without being discovered or coming into collision. Yet that undiscovered world for the spirit would be as real and as interesting as this world. Ignorance cannot justify any negative prophecy, but existence, while it is the home of particular certitudes, is also a cage in which the inevitable and infinite ignorance sings and dies imprisoned. Existence is self-centered, limited in character by the character which it chances to have, and in duration by the crawling fact that it exists while it is found existing. There is no necessary and all-comprehensive being except the realm of essence, to which existence is irrelevant, for whether the whole exists or only a part, or even if no part existed, the alternative fact would always be knocking at the door, and nothing in the actual facts could ever prove that the door would not suddenly open and let the contrary in. Like people living on the slopes of volcanoes, we ignore these possibilities. Although a catastrophe is rapidly approaching each of us in the form of death, and who knows how soon it may overtake the whole life of our planet. Nevertheless, except in the interest of detachment and freedom, spirit has no reason for dwelling on other possible worlds. Would any of them be less contingent than this one, or nearer to the heart of infinite being? And would not any of them, whatever its character, lead the spirit inexorably there? To master actual is the best way of transcending it. Those who know but one language, like the Greeks, seem to find language a purer and more transparent vehicle than those of us who notice its idiosyncrasies and become entangled in its meshes. So it is the saints most steeped, each in his traditional religion, who are nearest together in spirit, and if nature caused them to change places, it is they that, after a moment's pause to get their bearings, would be most at ease in one another's skins. No one is more unspiritual than a heretic, or more graceless and wretched than an unfrocked priest. Yet the frock of the faithful is but an earthly garment. It melts into the clouds which, in their ascension, they leave behind them. In what places the spirit shall awake, and how long and how freely it shall be suffered to flourish, are evidently questions of mundane physics and politics. It is the world's business to call down spirit to dwell in it, not the spirit's business to make a world in which to dwell. The friends of spirit, in their political capacity, will of course defend those forms of society in which, given their particular race and traditions, spirit may best exist. They will protect it in whatever organs and instruments it may already have appeared, and will take care that it pursues its contemplative life undisturbed in its ancient sanctuaries. Spirituality has material conditions, not only the general conditions of life and intuition, for a man must exist before he can become a spiritual man, but subtler and more special conditions, such as concentration of thought, indifference to fortune and reputation, warmth of temperament, because spirit cannot burn clear except at high temperature, disciplined into chastity and renunciation. These and other such conditions the master of novices does well to consider. But spirit itself, when once aroused, does not look back in that direction. Many Christian saints have qualified their spirituality with too much self-consciousness. It was no doubt their religious duty to examine their consciences and study to advance in holiness, but the holiness really did not begin until they forgot themselves in the thought of God. So with those who were consumed with zeal for the church, the conversion of sinners, and other works of charity. These are moral interests or duties accruing to men as members of some particular society. They are political cares. They may be accompanied by spiritual insight if it be really salvation or spiritualization of souls that preoccupies the missionary, and not some outward change of habit or allegiance that may make other people more like himself and ensure the dominance of his home traditions. Political zeal, even in the true friends of spirit, is not spiritual. A successful apostle must have rather a worldly mind, because he needs to have his hand on the pulse of the world. His appeal would not be intelligible if it were not threatening or spectacular or full of lewd promises. It will be only afterwards, perhaps when people have been domesticated in the new faith, that the Spirit will descend upon them. The Spirit itself is not afraid of being stamped out here or anxious to be kindled there. Its concern is not about its instances or manifestations. It is not essentially learned or social. Its kingdom is not of this world. It leaves propaganda to those who call themselves its friends, but probably know nothing of it, or are even its enemies, and only the agents of some worldly transformation, ultimately quite nugatory. Nor has the world on its side any obligation to cultivate the spiritual life. Obligations are moral. They presuppose a physical and social organism with imminent, spontaneous interests which may impose those obligations. The value and opportuneness of spiritual life in any of its possible forms must be adjudged by reason in view of the moral economy for which, in any instance, reason may speak. All values fall within the purview of ethics, which is a part of politics. Spirituality is the supreme good for those who are called to it, the few whose intellectual thirst can be quenched only by impartial truth and the self-annihilating contemplation of all being. The statesman and father of a family may not always welcome this disposition. It may seem to them wasteful and idle, just as the value of an artist must be judged by the world in view of all the interest which his art affects or subserves, while the artist himself lives only in his own labor, irresponsible, technical, and visionary. So the value of spiritual life in general, or in any of its incidental forms, must be judged morally by the world in view of its own ambitions, while the spirit, standing invisibly at its elbow, judges the world and its ambitions spiritually.